off, welcome everyone. 15th HRC conference. Want to thank the hosts again and all the work you've done and continue to do. I'd also like to point out that I really appreciate the fact that this isn't online. A lot of people are complaining about online. The Doge, they're complaining they want people to go back to work, but in this space with everything going on, I think it's great to be able to share research all around the world that cuts across all social, race, class, and income levels. So it's commendable. With that said, let's kick it off with Ibukun Filani, and he will be talking about membership categories and the construction of humor in Nigerian stand-up comedy. All right, hit it.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope my slides are visible.
Yes, they are.
All good.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm pleased to meet everybody in the panel. So my presentation is simply about the use of membership categories and the construction of humor in Nigerian stand-up comedy. Primarily, I'm taking these out of a research project where I am looking at how Nigerian stand-up performers talk about what they actually do within the performance sphere. In other words, I'm looking at their meta commentaries on the act of performing itself. One way to go about it is to do an interview with them and carry out an interview, ask them questions about what they do with their routines and all of that. And however, within social pragmatics, there is the assumption that everyday language users contain some kind of, rather use some kind of folk meta languages to talk about what they do. So that was what I was looking at, and I began to see a deliberate use of membership categories in how they talk about the act of comedy itself and in how they relate with their audiences. And that was how I arrived at the idea of membership categorization and the construction of humor in this context. So primarily my research is simply about comedians' reflexivity on the act of comedy performance. In some ways, some authors have construed that as self-reflexivity on the act of performance itself. In other words, comedians talk about their own professional identity on the one hand, and they make commentaries about their society on the other. Then again, some authors have also talked about comedians talking about how they relate with their audiences. In other words, how they view their act on the stage itself. So from this particular presentation, I am just looking at how comedians in Nigeria frame their identity as comedic performers in their routines, and how do they project themselves in relationship with their audiences, how they position themselves in relationship to their audiences across different comedy routines. A little bit about my methodology. I deliberately focused on a very short performance here, roughly less than 10 minutes. And what I'll be discussing is around 2 minutes of that. It's very small, and I understand that, but I think it's what will best capture what I want to present. So primarily there is a video I'm going to show shortly, which I transcribed and which serves as the basis of the features I have identified already. And then there is also an instance where I have to refer to another comedian to let us see that what I'm talking about is not a one-off or a minute thing that does not cut across all performances in the context of Nigerian stand-up comedy. That's that. So primarily it's just YouTube videos I'm using. I listen to them, I work them, and I use transcription. I use the conversation analysis method of transcribing and all of that. Then again, the other part is that what I'm looking out for are humorous sequences where a performer inculcates instances where he or she talks about himself as a comedian or talk about what he's doing as a stand-up comedian, and then talks about the audiences. The idea of moral sequences, I think, was introduced by Ruiz Gurillo or some other earlier works by the author, and it's simply defined as a conversational storytelling sequence where a particular joke is developed and it is interpassed by laughter or other forms of affiliation. In other words, there is a particular topic that forms the sequence, and that topic is developed to a peak, and then the audience responded to that sequence. And then primarily I'm using the theory of membership categorization analysis to investigate this in this particular presentation. A little bit about stand-up comedy. Primarily here, I'm focusing on linguistic approaches, and this is just some way of categorizing existing work in this area. Primarily, we could talk about pragmatics approaches to stand-up comedy, which are works that deliberately look at the idea of intentions and strategies for humor performances. There are also studies that deploy the perspective of conversation analysis, right, and construe stand-up comedy as a form of talk and interaction. And the primary objective is that whatever that is going on within stand-up comedy is a reflection of the institutional identity that anyone who participates in stand-up comedy enter into, all right, and then that's that. And then I also just deliberately bring out the idea of membership categorization analysis as also an approach to stand-up comedy, and that's simply because I'm looking at membership categories in this particular presentation. Again, a little bit about Nigerian stand-up comedy here. Primarily, what we call Nigerian stand-up comedy was initially fashioned after the British American tradition. Typically, a stand-up comedian is on stage and is talking directly to the audiences. But today, the idea of stand-up comedy is not necessarily in that sense, as there are lots and lot of stage enactments. Comedians could even act a drama on stage and they will still call it stand-up comedy. So what we take as stand-up comedy in Nigerian context now is a conglomerate, is a mixture of different genres of art that is performed to entertain people. And out of which we have someone performing stand-up comedy itself in that in that space. And then the other side of it is that some authors will simply argue that what we count as stand-up comedy in Nigeria is rooted in folkloric traditions of Nigeria. And that is simply because long before stand-up comedy started in 1995, when the very first official stand-up event was produced by Opa Williams as a comedy concert, there are other joking traditions we have in Nigeria, and those things are popular. And then the other side of it is that stand-up comedy is a public joking performance, and all of these joking traditions are also in the public. There are always things that are done in the public, not in a closed context. However, when some comedians have been interviewed in the media spaces, they always talk about the fact that especially those who started the genre of stand-up comedy in Nigeria, someone like Ali Baba will talk about the fact that they were actually studying the likes of George Carlin, Ed Murphy's, and they will look at their comedies and then they will produce their joke in the Nigerian context. They make it to situate into Nigerian context. One thing that usually that is very important is the understanding of the multilingual nature of Nigeria, which facilitated how stand-up comedy is done and all other forms of public joking genres. Stand-up comedy is very popular in Nigeria in the southern part of the country, but it's not so popular in the northern part of the country. And that's simply because the northern part of the country is much more given to traditional values that are defined by Islamic religion. And then in the southern part of the country, there is widespread of education, widespread of English language, widespread of urban vernacular. So Nigerian Pidgin is actually used as the language of performance. And since comedy itself is a form of public joking genre, and comedians are always aware that if they speak in English, which is in the country's lingua franca, they limit the number of people who can participate in their performance or the people who can enjoy their comedy. So they have to look for a language that everybody knows or everybody can relate with, which is Nigerian Pidgin as the language of performance. Primarily, Nigerian Pidgin is a language that is influenced by all languages in the country, particularly the languages in the southern part of the country. The lexis of the language is primarily English, all right? So lexically, it's English, but structurally, it is Niger codofinian languages, all right? So in some ways, we will find English words, and then they are in a sequence, a systematic sequence. So that makes it distinguishable from what we call broken English. All right. I go further now. This is an example of a performance where the a moral sequence where the performers deliberately use some membership categories to talk about the act of comedic performance. And then after this video, I will try to analyze this particular, I think less than 1 minute sequence in the subsequent slides. I just want to confirm if my audio is audible.
Yes, I heard you started. It should be coming through.
Okay, fine then. Thank you.
But with all due respect, Osh, not ever introduce me like that again. But where my destiny and past, successful men. Joey Zaza, Massacre, First Oye. Because they say I've traveled far and wide. Where I don't really travel, go. Say I'm the richest. Then my oga go say why he say I get money pass and wow, now big name they really kiss small dog. I beg, let's be guided. With all due respect, not introduce me like that again. I bet that in a rumor, not really. Because I come here deliberately. As I hear see all the shaman they around. I even send DM give get who I send DM give send day to the everything they handle. So this is the way I dress like copper.
Okay, in that particular performance, I picked out 3 forms of category devices. There are those that are relevant to the profession of comedy itself, the identity of a performer, and then there are those that are relevant to the act of performing joke, and then there are instances where the performer try to use social class, the existing social divides within the wider Nigerian cultural scene to make joke. Here is a little bit of transcripts from that, talking about not being introduced in the presence of Destiny Elpers, whom she calls successful rich men. I will talk more about all of these lines in the subsequent slides, so I don't have to go about them now. Okay, so starting with the very first one, the professional relevant categories. In this instance, there are instances where comedians talk about the act of comedy performance in Nigeria. And one of the very important idea here is to understand that stand-up comedy in Nigeria is organized as a comedy concert, where a comedian is actually the concert organizer and the host. We invite all other comedians to perform. The underlying thing here is that the person who Occupy, who does that, is meant to pay every comedian who performs on that stage. So when this particular comedian came on stage, Drill Worry Pikin, she is one of the very few female comedians in Nigeria. She started with, but with all due respect, Osh, don't ever introduce me like that. And then she goes further later on in the performance to talk about the fact that the same Osh did not really pay us, but he has introduced her to make everybody think that she had actually made it. What she was doing in that sequence was to refer to how the hosts of that particular comedy concert introduced her to the audiences. And then when the host was introducing her, he praised her to high heavens as a very successful comedian. And in that sequence, the performer interpreted that as a way of setting her up negatively, not to achieve her intention of performing. In other words, she had come to that place to make money, and the way she was introduced could impact how people will give her money. And in other words, one of the things that is happening here is the understanding that when they perform and they perform very well, some members of the audience rise up to the stage and then throw some money at them, throw some cash at them. All right. So she interpreted the introduction sequence as something that will not make her to make a lot of money. Another common thing about the industry in Nigeria is that many times the comedians talk about the comedy progenitor category. They always talk about performers who had been in the industry ahead of them. All right. So also in that introductory sequence where she got on stage, she was talking that, okay, say I am the richest, my Oga boss AY, say I am richer than him. Then she goes on to say big names do kill small dogs. So in other words, in my Oga boss AY, she's using the category of boss. Oga is a Nigerian lingua that translates strictly to boss. And interestingly, she used the two in a sequence to refer to another comedian called AY. AY is a very successful Nigerian stand-up comedian who has organized comedy concerts all across Nigeria, in Europe, and in North America. And when AY organizes his shows, he invites numerous performers, fly them out of the country, process whatever they need to get out of the country to go and perform. And in this instance, she was talking about the way the comedian has praised her to the high heavens, talking about how successful she is. And then she said, big names, all right, I don't have a big name, which you have, can actually kill small dogs. The joke performance relevant category is another instance that I find. In this particular time, the comedian will always refer to the audiences, all right? Generally, they will talk about how they construct the audiences, how the audience reacts, and then they create certain words or certain lexical items or rather certain membership categories to construe how they perceive the audiences. And here, she talked about, he introduced me, referring to her own identity within the interaction. And then she talked about the audience as you people, all right? Although this appears to be very general, but as she goes on talking about, as goes on in the performance, she narrowed the idea of you people to Lagos.
Ibukun, sorry to interrupt. You have about 2 minutes.
Oh my God. Okay. All right. She goes about Lagos, talking about the audience, the venue, the location in the city where the performance is actually taking place. Okay. The last one I'm going to raise here because of my time. Audience members versus poor comedy performance. Again here, she evokes some categories, chairmen around here, referring to very rich members within the audience who would likely come to the state to give her some money based on how she dressed. All right. this distinction is primarily based on the presumption that some people in the audience are very rich, and these are people who sit close to the stage, and then these are people who pay more for their tickets so that they can occupy privileged positions within the performance space. In conclusion, one of the things I've seen in this research is that there is deliberate deployment of kinship terms of marking membership of the profession. So in many instances, they will talk about my brother, all right. Number two, they always refer to the hierarchical structure of the stand-up comedy in Nigeria. The terms like my bros, my oga, all right, is just a way of respecting those who are senior in the profession. And when they do this, they sometimes map everybody in the audience in the performance sphere into two groups, and then they target the people who occupy that particular group. For instance, when she was talking about herself, she made herself target as a poor lady, as some of self-denigrating humor. I think I should end here now and see.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ibukun. Everybody, round of applause. Fantastic. Okay, so as I said, if you have any questions, either raise your hand or please place your questions in the chat. Anyone? Bueller. Yes, Joe, please.
Hi,
And
thank you. Do stand-up comics in Nigeria ever do crowd work? Do they ever interact with the crowd for their comedy? And the reason I ask is because I think in the US, when a stand-up comic does crowd work, the comic is in a superior position. Like it's a real message that the comic is in control, and the comic makes fun of the people in the audience and makes jokes at their expense. But I think what you're saying is stand-up comics in Nigeria don't always take that position that the comic is the one in charge. So do they do crowd work, and how would that fit into your studies?
Yes, they do that a lot. But in many instances, those crowd walks are meant to turn the humor on the audience, and then they still remain within the institutionally privileged position of determining who the person will be. And then in recent times, they use that to solicit, quote unquote, solicit some kind of how I don't know how to place this in simple language, either to deliberately target someone who tries to make himself or herself uncooperative with the institutional identity that they have within the performance sphere. For instance, when someone deliberately asks questions and then the person is not supposed to ask questions while the performer is ongoing, the performer gets down and does that. In some instances, when someone is a member of a popular icon within society, all right, once they cite someone, maybe a musician, a politician who had come to the show, they do that deliberately. And when they do that, they just made those people the target of the joke.
I see.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Other questions? Yes. Ian.
Hi, thank you for that talk. That was quite wonderful. I have a question, and this might be off topic at first, but hopefully it blends in, about the history of Nigerian stand-up. You said that it sort of emerges, or the first concert was in 1995
Yep.
By
Yep.
Opa
Yep.
Williams,
Yeah.
based on the British and North American style. So I guess my question is, was it an attempt for someone, for example, Opa or someone else who had been part of the Nigerian expatriate community, diaspora, had seen stand up in London or New York and then had tried to bring it back, or did it come through media examples? Was the media of the time, now cable television and satellite and so on, bringing those as samples?
Yeah.
And I do have a follow-up, but I'm interested in that question.
Yeah, it's much more complicated than how I've presented it in simple terms, all right? But primarily, stand-up comedy is traced to Alleluia Akpo Bamiria. I don't know how to pronounce his name very well, but his common stage name is Ali Baba. Ali Baba started comedy in the late 1980s as an undergraduate in his university. What he would do was to MC, do MCs and make jokes and all of that. And then he went to Lagos, tried to set up a company that was into comedy, and people never took him serious. And then Okpa Williams, on the other hand, was someone who had some money, and he was very much more interested in investing into the emerging Nollywood industry in Nigeria then. So it will make money available to people, and then they will produce movies.
Okay.
And at some point, they went to shoot a movie in a clinic, and then one of them said a joke, and then the joke was very funny, and even those who were sick and the doctors were laughing. And then he had an idea that, well, we can transform these into something that can make money. So they had the idea of shooting stage comedies.
Okay.
And then the earliest people they could think of was Ali Baba as the very first person they would bring. And then in the 1995 shows, primarily the people who featured in that show were not necessarily quote unquote stand-up comedians rather, people who were strictly known for stand-up comedy, but they were actors who were into comic roles in Nigerian Nollywood and the Nigerian radio shows and all of that. So Okpa Williams gathered all of them together, placed them on a stage, sold tickets for that stage event, and then they were so surprised that people turned out and they made some money out of that, and then subsequently they reproduced that.
Okay.
And then as it was going on, many Nigerian graduates decided that, okay, rather than look for a job out there that is non-existent or that is difficult to get, they can get themselves engaged through comedy performance. So somehow, the very first person they regarded as the progenitor, who is Ali Baba, all right, they all went to Ali Baba, who trained them, and then for many years until 2013 or 2014, Okpa Williams was having his shows from 1995 to that point when he decided to discontinue the shows, thinking that it was no longer relevant because the other comedians were also having their own individual show. But typically, a stand-up comedy show in Nigeria is not just one person performing, but is a concert where quite a number of other comedians come to that stage to perform in different sequences. And then sometimes they bring musicians to sing, they act drama, they do all sorts of things. They just want to entertain people. So it's more or less a conglomerate of entertainment for the audience and that.
Okay. And I'm about to ask a question that could probably take an hour to answer, and I'm asking you to keep it because I don't want to be selfish for this time. But how long did it take for it to stop being Nigerians doing something approaching British and North American style stand-up comedy and becoming Nigerian stand-up comedy that is influenced by vernacular histories or vernacular patterns of comic talk and the sweet talk of
Well, that might be difficult to straighten out directly, depends on where one stands on the ideology of the colonialism or not that and all of that. But typically, as it stands now, nobody wants to talk about, or even the comedians no longer talk about the influence of the American whatever, because they now have Nigerian comedians to look up to, right? But before the turn of the century, what was happening, what they would say in the newspaper is that, well, I watch George Carlin, I watch Ed Murphy, I read joke books published by whoever in North America, look at the strategy they use, then I will reconstruct that, and then I will come and use it in Nigeria. That's that on one. And however, again, the content itself, even though they might have on the study and all of that, the content of their joke, the way they perform and all of that, they enact Nigerianness. I mean, the way they do it, I mean, it's not in any way influenced by that other side. One other thing that I would mention is that we used to have radio, comic radio shows, which was very, very common before the internet age. And then many of those people who were involved produced comic, I mean, I don't know what to call it. It defies genres, all right? The point is that some of these enactments defies genres that are known in the Western world. They are just created the way they are. And then, you know, this person is just talking about humor. What might be spoof, satirical news shows, like late night shows, that is very, very different from its kind of enactment in Nigeria, you know, so it's very unique. It reflects sociocultural instances, it reflects languages and all of that within our local culture.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for monopolizing all the time.
No, that's no problem. How may I saw you have a question here. We're running out of time. Did that answer